an active shooter. We have an active shooter inside the fairgrounds.
Welcome to Active Shooter, a podcast that covers the whys, the hows, and the aftermath of active shooter and mass casualty events.
They have an active shooter in the building. A second call says they are being attacked.
I've been shot. 16910 means we got shots fired at 4:15 a.m. Route 91. Sounded like an automatic firearm.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Thank you for listening.
You are listening to Active Shooter, a podcast that may contain adult themes, explicit language, and graphic depictions of violence. Portions of this show may be traumatic for those under 18. Listener discretion is advised.
The breaking news of another safe haven for American families shattered by gunfire, the shooting at the mall outside Portland, Oregon. Those eyewitnesses describing a man with a white mask, body armor, a semi-automatic rifle, the gunshots ringing out one after the other as families were trapped near familiar places, names like Macy's and Olive Garden.
One thing we've become used to in the retelling of the tragic mass shooting events is that there is almost always a clear escalation, or an obvious point in time where you can look back and say, that's where it all started to go wrong. It will never be an excuse or even an explanation for these alarming mass murders that continue to rise in numbers. No, there are no excuses that can ever be offered, but there is nearly always a point where you almost see the making of an active shooter. However, there will always be those outliers. No clear motive, no clear breaking point, no clear mental health issues, no explainable reason for the terror and evil wrought upon innocent people. Today's shooting is one such case. The attack doesn't seem to be clearly planned, the shooting site doesn't seem to be specifically targeted for any reason, and the inexplicable becomes even more so when we cannot verbalize the why of it all. The shooting at the Clackamas town center left 8,000 to 10,000 people vulnerable to one man's brutality, and though the damage was kept to a reasonable minimum, the loss of even 2 lives is too many.
Active Shooter the podcast is a High Five Holly production, and I'm your host, JT. If you've listened to our prior episodes, you know that the Active Shooter podcast team has taken the no notoriety pledge, and we will not be sharing the real name of the shooters that we cover. We will be giving the shooters a pseudonym and refer to them by that name throughout the episode. This will help in clearing up any confusion in the story, while remaining true to our pledge in not naming the shooter by their actual name. We will refer to today's shooter as
Steve. The Clackamas Town Center was bustling with shoppers on Tuesday, December 11th, 2012. Though it was still mid-afternoon, the mall was packed with people rushing to and fro, searching for the perfect gifts for their loved ones. The weather outside was typical of an Oregon winter, chilly, but not freezing, with a light rain falling throughout much of the day. The sun rose at 7:40 a.m., but by the time the sun fell, countless lives were forever impacted by the trauma and horror inflicted by one young man. However, we need to go back to 12:15 a.m., well before the sun began to rise. In fact, for some, the night hadn't actually ended at all. 22-year-old Steve met up with his friend Seth, which is a pseudonym that we will assign for clarity but also to protect his identity, as he was never proven to have had any involvement whatsoever. Steve and Seth hung out together at Putter's Bar and Grill for a little over an hour before leaving and heading to a nearby 7-Eleven, to buy 3 22-ounce beers, before heading back to Seth's house. Once there, they played pool, drank beer, and smoked some marijuana. Seth went behind a white shelf in his closet, which was within Steve's view, and grabbed out an AR-15 that he proceeded to show to his friend. Around 3 a.m., surveillance footage showed the guys entering the local Denny's, and they were there until about 3:50 a.m. Around 3 a.m., surveillance footage showed the guys entering the local Denny's, and they were there until around 3:50 a.m. The waitress later reported that the pair didn't appear even slightly suspicious, and were very nice, good customers. They returned back to Seth's house at 5 a.m., and sometime between then and noon, Steve crept into Seth's closet, stole the AR-15, and snuck out of the house while Seth slept. At about noon, Steve got home and spoke with his roommates for a bit before leaving with a small bag of clothes and a pair of boots. It's unclear precisely what Steve did over the next few hours, but at 3 p.m., he stopped to visit his other friend, who we will call Terry. Terry lived approximately 2 miles from the mall. The guys smoked weed and chatted aimlessly for a bit, and Steve talked of wanting to move to Hawaii. They didn't hang out for long, however, because Steve apparently had other plans that he didn't share with anyone. From Terry's, Steve headed towards the Clackamas town center. Steve parked his green 1995 Jetta at the mall located at 12,000 Southeast 82nd Avenue in the south parking lot between Macy's and Chipotle. After collecting a .223 caliber Stag Arms Stag 15 Model 2 semi-automatic rifle, Steve walked away from his car as the wiper blade swished back and forth behind him. Leaving his identification behind, he placed a Jason Voorhees-style hockey mask on his face and entered Macy's, which was an anchor store at the mall, meaning that there were several doors on the exterior part of the mall as well as doors leading to the interior. At 3:28 p.m., Steve hit the doors of the mall running, and to say that the sight was startling would be a massive understatement. In addition to the hockey mask, Steve, at 5'7", wore black jeans, black athletic shoes, a black thermal t-shirt, and a black vest that carried a full ammunition magazine in a pocket at the back side. The look was capped off with a head full of black hair. Witnesses, unsure what to think of the sight, believed initially that Steve was wearing a paintball outfit with a toy rifle. It might have seemed downright silly, if it wasn't so chillingly evil. During the short walk from the car to the mall, Steve dropped one of the 5 loaded magazines in the parking lot where a witness happened to catch sight of Steve just before he entered. A woman that was loading her shopping bags into her own car glanced up when she noticed the man, dressed all in black, wearing a hockey mask with spiky black hair sticking out the back, orange earplugs, and a vest with pockets that had things sticking out. The woman was sure that the shooter wasn't carrying a backpack or bag. He just took off at a full run towards the mall, without uttering a single word, or even looking her way. The woman strapped her child back into her own car as quickly as possible and moved to race away from the mall. As she was leaving, she noticed people running from the store and attempted to call 911, but she couldn't get through. Inside of the mall, by the way of the Macy's store, Steve ran toward the atrium and began firing into the food court. People began diving underneath tables while others hid behind kiosks.
Started my shift at 3:30. I got there about 2 minutes early. I walked through the food court, went downstairs to my kiosk, which is right below the food court. When I got there, I was talking to my employee. All of a sudden, we heard a big bang. We covered our ears and we got down. And then all of a sudden, like a matter of 5 seconds later, we heard rapid fire, bang, 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 bang. And I just took off running. I mean, I don't know where my employee is. I heard she's still inside the mall.
A witness inside the mall described Steve as looking very focused. He moved around with purpose and wasn't in a hurry or a rush, even though people all around him were crying, screaming, calling 911 or calling family members. There was a point when a witness reported that Steve paused and began to shake his weapon, almost as if it had jammed. The first person Steve shot was Cindy Ann Ewell. She was shot in the back, and the bullet perforated her heart, lung, and sternum. Bystanders desperately tried to save the woman by applying pressure to the wound, but she died at the scene. The injuries and blood loss were just too much. 15-year-old Kristina Shevchenko was walking with her friend to the town center MAX station, which is the local transit, when she was shot in the chest. She was able to make it out of the mall to be taken for treatment. The third person Steve shot was 45-year-old Stephen Dorsythe, who was sitting by a kiosk talking to his father on the phone. He was shot in the head and killed instantly. The tan, long-sleeved collared shirt he wore was saturated with blood. Many patrons raced from the mall as soon as the shooting started. It was a crazy, mad dash for any nearby exit, though many shoppers opted to stay inside the mall, but take cover, hiding in any place they could immediately find.
There was like 11 shots fired about, and everybody just kind of stood in the mall or in the store and looked at each other like, was that really gunshots we just heard? And then some guy came and told us to evacuate out to the back stairs.
The shots were really loud and really scary. That's what it was. I mean, it was echoing all through the mall, so nobody knew where it was coming from at first, but it was echoing all through the mall.
How many shots?
I heard 3, and then when I saw people ran, I knew it wasn't just a joke, so I started running. That's all I heard was 3, and then that's when everybody started running.
It's a really scary situation. There were parents, people who had kids that were out at the playing at the play structure, people who had sons, daughters who were out in the mall doing other things. So it was a pretty tense situation, and there was some people that were crying, and it was really kind of hard.
Steve walked closer to the food court, still aimlessly shooting when he came upon 16-year-old Alina Pavlenko, who was an employee. He aimed the gun at the teenager and fired. Though miraculously, he missed. 4 children were inside the Build-A-Bear workshop with staff members, who managed to successfully keep the kids distracted with arts and crafts and snacks. During the shooting rampage, Steve dropped 3 more magazines to the ground. He began to head towards the JCPenney and attempted to reload the gun, but it had jammed, so he wasn't successful initially. He never said a word to anyone. He gave no commands, and due to the mask, he showed no expression. Another witness, a concealed weapon permit holder named Nick Melly, saw the shooter and seized the moment. He drew his Glock 22 and took aim at the shooter, but stopped, just short of taking the shot. You see, there was a bystander standing behind the shooter, so Nick didn't take the chance. However, seeing that someone was willing to fight back might have just been the catalyst for what happened next.
I had to process, okay, I see him, but who's behind him? You know, if I fire and miss, I could hit someone in the back that I don't even know is there, because when a bullet goes, it doesn't care who it hits or what it hits. It's just going to go until it stops.
Steve ran into a backroom storage hallway, where he encountered an employee who was completely unaware of the shooting that had transpired out in the mall. Steve raised the rifle at the employee, but at the last moment didn't shoot him. Instead, Steve ran down a flight of stairs to the lower level. When he reached the bottom, he cleared the jam on the gun and shot himself in the head. The entire ordeal lasted just over 20 minutes from start to finish. The very first 911 call was placed approximately 37 seconds after the shooter entered the mall, and the time elapsed from the initial 911 call to when police entered was only 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
We're at Macy's, upstairs, fragrance.
Who was shot?
I don't know. I'm hiding underneath the register. He's got a white face mask on black. He's got a small, almost looks like a
black on black coat or black on black shirt.
Black on black coat.
Within 6 minutes from the first dispatch, there were 17 officers inside the mall, and by 3:51 p.m., the Clackamas County Sheriff's deputies located the shooter in the service hallway by JCPenney, dead from a gunshot wound to the right temple, and the white mask laid on the ground just in front of him.
At this point, this is no longer an active shooter. We believe the shooter has been neutralized, and we are securing the mall, securing the scene, and treating the wounded.
Police radioed to back up that the shooter was a 1244, which means a deceased person. A command post was established at the east end of the mall parking lot. Multiple ambulances arrived, believing there would be dozens of victims. The police spent hours clearing the mall and searching for survivors to bring to safety. A total of 17 rounds were fired, but Steve originally started with 128, which includes the magazines he dropped. It seems that Steve targeted random people, and he inexplicably allowed others to escape. Many people suffered from various bruises and scratches and scrapes in their efforts to escape the mall. Broken glass littered the floor around the escalator, which was surrounded by glass panels. Glass shards were scattered all over the mall floor and kiosks from storefronts that were shot out. Several people hid inside the Panera Bread restaurant located on the south side of the mall, and 9 employees were located hiding inside of a panic type of room in Macy's. Around 18 people, including employees and customers, hid inside a back storage room at Hollister, where they sat and waited, terrified, waiting for someone to rescue them. One eyewitness claimed to have seen the shooter sporadically looking around, as if he were looking for something. After the shooting ended, an eerie quiet fell over the mall, and everything was silent, save for the light Christmas music that played in the background. It was a cruel reminder of the joyous reason so many were visiting the mall to begin with. Civilians were escorted from the mall, which had been completely cleared, and even by the day after the shooting, the mall remained on lockdown. Witnesses were transported to the TriMet garage nearby. There, they would be interviewed and determined if they needed medical assistance, which would be offered accordingly. So many witnesses reported that they believed the entire incident was a joke, and that the shooter had a fake gun. Initially, police didn't know Steve's identity, since he left his ID back in his car. They were, ultimately, able to make the connection after Steve's roommate called the tip line and gave the police his name. Steve's roommate must have seen some news coverage, and after finding empty ammunition boxes in Steve's room, the roommate went and did a Google search for the ammo and discovered that it was the same kind used in an AR-15, which was the same kind of gun he saw on the news. Not taking a chance, the roommate called it in and probably saved the police a substantial amount of time that was best used investigating why this happened. It was also learned later that Steve had marijuana in his system, as well as a small level of cocaine, which would indicate the drug was used around 36 to 48 hours earlier. Meanwhile, around 4 p.m., Seth was back at home panicking when he realized that his firearm was missing. There was only one place it could have gone, and only one other person who would have had access. And he wasn't there anymore. Seth had to work at 5 and figured that when he finished his shift for the night, he was going to confront Steve about the stolen gun. Poor Seth probably thought it was going to be sold or perhaps just taken out into the woods and shot. But either way, he never imagined that Steve would ever use his gun for such a horrific purpose. When Steve got to work at Mamma Mia's, an Italian restaurant, he told a coworker about the stolen gun. Seth had purchased it legally and didn't have a reason to hide it. He just perhaps should have been more careful who he physically showed it to. After Seth's coworker left for the night, he heard about the shooting and immediately thought about Seth's stolen gun. He called the restaurant to tell Seth about it and encourage him to report the stolen gun to the police. Seth didn't need to be told twice. After realizing he didn't have a cell phone, Seth left and went to the 7-Eleven and used a payphone to call the police and report what he knew. Seth was cooperative and allowed police to search his residence, and the empty rifle case was located. He gave police the paperwork for the gun, along with the serial number that would match the shooting weapon. After all was said and done, and knowing what the gun was used for, Seth stated to police that he didn't ever want the gun back.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter.
Active shooter, mass casualty incidents.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter.
Active shooter, mass casualty incidents.
54-year-old Cindy Ann Ewell was born in Portland, Oregon, and at the time of her death, she was a hospice nurse at Kaiser Permanente. Her career was spent helping others find peace in their last days, which makes it so much more heartbreaking that she would never get the opportunity to say goodbye to her family and friends, just as she helped so many others do. An oft-described goofball, Cindy loved hiking and running, but her passion always came back to helping others. She raised money for cancer research in her free time. Caring and giving are the core traits of who she was. Survived by her daughter, 22-year-old Jenna, 13-year-old stepson, and beloved husband Robert, who was also a hospice nurse. The couple met at Kaiser Permanente, hit it off right away, and could not help but fall in love. Cindy's light and generous spirit will never be forgotten. 45-year-old Stephen Forsyth was born on February 1st, 1967, in Denver, Colorado, and moved to Portland when he was just an infant. He would eventually move to West Lynn, Oregon, where he lived until his very untimely death. Stephen graduated from Lake Oswego High School and went on to attend the University of San Diego, where he studied political science and international business, and was professionally certified by the American Marketing Association while working for many years in media sales and as a management executive for several radio stations. An extremely positive man, he turned his grandfather's hobby of wood carving into a custom wood design business called Costumes, where he sold unique wooden items. Stephen was an incredibly loving man who was so passionate about sports that he coached youth sports, but his proudest accomplishment was his family, which included his wife of 15 years, Carla, and their 2 children, a daughter, Katie, and a son, Alex. He will be deeply missed by friends, co-workers, and family alike. Steve was born on March 16, 1990, and was raised in a neighborhood in southeast Portland called Lentz. He was raised mainly by an aunt after his mother passed away from cancer when she was only 22 years old, which perhaps coincidentally, or not, was the same age Steve was when he killed 2 people before taking his own life. Steve was only 3 years old when his mom died, and his father was in and out of his life and, at best, consistently inconsistent. Despite being raised by her, Steve was estranged from his aunt, and had been since he was about 18 years old. He attended Milwaukee High School in Milwaukee, Oregon, for the first 3 years of high school, before transferring to Oregon City High School in Oregon City, where he graduated from in 2008. Though he went to Clackamas Community College in 2009, it doesn't appear that he earned any degree or certificate. He worked at a gyro restaurant called Big Bertha's, which was a very popular local eatery. There may have been some of the typical red flags we might expect from so many shooters that have been covered on this podcast. However, there are differences. Steve was, by all accounts, quite well liked, and had a number of friends he regularly spent time with, and even his employers thought highly of him. At the time of the shooting, Steve was living in the basement part of a house with a few roommates about 10 minutes from the mall. They all shared the kitchen and bathroom, and they had their own personal spaces. Steve wasn't especially close with anyone in his family. He had a stepsister, though it doesn't appear that they spent any significant time together. There was no disciplinary record at school, and Steve was a middle-of-the-road average student who got decent grades. He didn't quite excel, but he didn't struggle either. Before his job at Big Bertha's, he worked at a bakery, and there is no evidence of issues there either. At one point, early on in his life, Steve shared with others his plans to enlist in the Marines. However, before that could happen, he broke his ankle in a bike accident and had pins placed in the foot, thereby precluding him from joining the military. Steve couldn't walk for around 6 months as a result of the accident, and claims that his aunt took all of his pain meds away and gave him marijuana to consume instead. As mentioned, Steve did have friends, and one particular acquaintance who had known him for about 2 years and had met Steve through his own brother, who had also been Steve's friend since childhood. The friend of a friend said he never saw Steve so much as upset, and that he had a great personality. Steve got along well with others, though he enjoyed more solitary activities like skateboarding and riding bikes. Overall, he was an active guy that liked all sorts of physical activities. In fact, on his Facebook page he described himself as, quote, an adrenaline junkie, and he'd even taken classes to become a smoke jumper, which is someone who parachutes into forest fires. On the whole, he had regular hobbies like watching movies and comedy shows, playing video games like race car games and Call of Duty, and playing pool. He was even called a pool shark by many that knew him. One friend of Steve's told police investigators that he introduced his cousin to Steve and the two began dating. The relationship blossomed, until the couple found out that they were pregnant. Though the pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, and the relationship ultimately ended about a month before the shooting. Despite the rocky relationship with his father, Steve did live with his dad for a time towards the end of his senior year in high school. Towards the end of his senior year of high school, it seems that he and his aunt had stopped speaking, so he moved in with his dad. It was later reported that Steve and the aunt had a fight over some inheritance and stopped speaking. During the time he lived with his dad, Steve started hanging out with the proverbial wrong crowd, and was eventually kicked out of his father's. At the time of the shooting, the father and son hadn't spoken in 2 years. He worked at Carl's Jr. during high school and held several other jobs after, including construction and working at the Goodwill. A former classmate later said that Steve drank and smoked weed in high school, though she wasn't sure or certain how much or often. She continued saying that he liked to go target shooting, but never gave off the impression of having an obsession with guns, and she even went so far as to say that Steve was a good person who, quote, lit up the world with his smile, and others agreed, saying how much he liked making others laugh. Things weren't all roses and rainbows, though. Nothing is perfect. Others that knew him said Steve was experiencing depressive episodes and struggling with family issues because of his mom dying so young and him living with an aunt. About a month before the shooting, Steve began to sell off his possessions, one of which was a handgun. While it's a potential red flag for self-harm, he was eager to tell people that he was moving to Hawaii, and any time he talked about the move, he was happy and excited, and it didn't seem forced or feigned.
He had his plane ticket, he was ready to go, and then this happened, and it just makes me think if Hawaii was even in the back of his mind.
No one knew why Steve was planning to move to Hawaii. There were no family or friends, or even a job waiting for him there. The acquaintance we spoke of earlier indicated that Steve talked about receiving an inheritance from his grandfather a while back, but wasn't sure how much or if it had anything to do with the move. Before the alleged move, he was dating a girl, but broke up because he was moving. Steve told everyone that he was leaving on Friday, December 8th, just days before the shooting. However, he claimed he missed his flight and had to rebook it. There was another friend and classmate of Steve's that we will call Lane, and she claimed that he was like a brother to her. They were very close, and he even went to her house for the holidays, since he didn't have a mom or full-time dad in his life. Steve had even told Lane about his move to Hawaii, and that he intended to live with a friend who was already there. Lane claims she didn't know the other friend in Hawaii or if they even existed, but on December 4th, he did come to her and told her he'd sold his car. It couldn't be true, because it was the same vehicle he drove to the mall the day of the shooting. Steve texted Lane on December 8th, saying he missed his flight, but rebooked, and was still moving, so she believed he was already gone by the time of the shooting. She told police investigators that Steve drank and smoked weed daily, and she was actually concerned he might become an alcoholic based on his daily consumption. She knew he received about $28,000 from his grandfather, who recently passed away, but Steve basically blew the money on rent, a TV, a tattoo, a pistol, and a new car. Despite some of his ups and downs and struggles, Lane didn't think he would hurt anyone, and he never spoke of harming himself or others.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
During the investigation, police located a container in Steve's bedroom closet that contained ammunition, smaller caliber than used in the shooting, and a black nylon police duty belt with a package of foam earplugs. Other items seized were a laptop computer, a glass pipe, a handwritten note with travel plans, and several magazines for ammunition, along with miscellaneous gun supplies, shooting targets, and ammo. They questioned many people close to Steve, including his ex-girlfriend Brittany, who told police the couple met in May of 2011 and were friends for months before becoming boyfriend and girlfriend. They spent time together hobby shooting, though she claims Steve never seemed obsessed with guns. She told police that he had a 9mm pistol that he used for target shooting, but he was keenly aware of the safety precautions and always observed them. She explained that they were like most young couples. They liked hiking and going to parties and playing beer pong, and while Steve drank casually and socially, she didn't think it was a problem for him. The relationship ended in March of 2012, and it was an amicable enough breakup. She described Steve as a peaceful person who didn't provoke or get into fights. Leading up to the shooting, Steve was essentially running Big Bertha's and had expressed interest in purchasing the restaurant with his inheritance money. The business was struggling and going under, and Steve felt he could save it. However, around October, the owner of the deli told Steve they were selling the business to a group of people as it made more business and financial sense. This decision seems to have sent Steve spiraling a bit, because that same month, he changed his Facebook cover photo to an image that stated, quote, "Follow your dreams." Cancelled. Friends say he didn't handle the decision well. Despite all this, some friends contend that they still aren't sure that the inheritance from his grandfather ever existed, and express doubts about the Hawaii move. Some friends even went so far as to question whether he even wanted to purchase the restaurant. Indeed, the store's owner indicated he felt that Steve was really only upset at having a new boss. What seems to be indisputable is his drug use. Friends say he tried cocaine before and dabbled with psychedelic mushrooms, and he drank and smoked marijuana regularly. Police interviewed Steve's roommates at length. One roommate, we will call Chad, said that Steve told him he was moving to Hawaii, but the date he was leaving continuously changed. Chad said that Steve had a ton of friends and was well liked, but also informed the police that he knew Steve had a white Halloween hockey mask and believed it matched what was shown on the news. On December 8, 2012, 3 days before the shooting and the day Steve claimed he would be flying to Hawaii, he went to a local Walmart and bought paper targets, foam earplugs, and ammunition. He paid $30 in cash, and the entire trip was captured on video surveillance. The following day, the 9th, he went to Wholesale Sports and purchased more ammo and paper targets, and again paid cash, $50, and then went back to Walmart and spent another $50 cash for additional ammunition. Steve was actually supposed to leave for Hawaii on Thursday, December 6, 2012 at 3 p.m., flying out on Alaska Airlines. He claimed to a friend that he missed the flight and rescheduled for Thursday, December 13, 2012. His friend Terry told investigators that he didn't think Steve really wanted to move and was feeling down, but whenever he mentioned it to Steve, he became evasive and changed the subject. When the time came to say goodbye, it seemed like Steve was stalling and didn't want to leave, and had even said that things had gone bad, but wouldn't elaborate further. All this said, Teddy didn't think his friend was violent, and chalked all of this up to sadness, or some depression. Before the shooting, though, Teddy came to the correct conclusion when his mom called him to tell him about it. He knew Steve was wearing all black when he left his house, and he was acting out of the ordinary, and he later disclosed to police that, when he left, Steve hugged him. Not that there's a single thing wrong with hugging, but that wasn't what Steve normally did when he left. In fact, Terry could only think of one other time Steve hugged him, and that was after they had been separated at an underage drinking party, and then were reunited. Terry said Steve looked like he was going to cry when he left. It was later discovered that one of Steve's roommates located assault rifle ammo in his bedroom, and Steve became worried that he would be turned in. Overall, the active investigation produced 311 tips called in to the police. Steve's downward spiral seemed to be very rapid. On December 1st, 2012, he ended his relationship with his girlfriend, saying he was moving to Hawaii. She didn't have the money to go with him, but it's unclear whether he wanted her to take the alleged trip with him. On December 5th, Steve quit his job, saying he was moving to Hawaii, and on the 7th, he stopped by Big Bertha's to say goodbye to his coworkers. Steve's roommates were on a trip to Las Vegas and returned on December 9th, and were surprised to see Steve still at home. He was already supposed to be gone. Steve claimed he partied too much on Friday and overslept, missed his flight, so he rebooked the flight for the following weekend. By December 11th, he committed 2 acts of murder, 1 act of attempted murder, and 1 act of suicide, changing hundreds of lives in ways most cannot ever comprehend. This case remains one of the most baffling because it's so inexplicable. Miraculously, the loss of life was not as bad as it could have been, and there was a tremendous police and community response to such a devastating situation. You see, we all have the unique ability to help prevent such a catastrophic event from happening if we keep our eyes and ears open and never hesitate to report when something or someone just doesn't seem right. It is our sincerest wish that there will be no more active or mass shooting stories to tell. We pray that love will prevail over hate.
Too many have died! We should say to ourselves, not one more!
In the meantime, we urge our listeners to stay aware of your surroundings and keep in touch with your loved ones. If you see something, say something. You never know how many lives you'll be saving.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Active Shooter, the podcast. Remember, if you see something, say something. There's no telling how many lives you may be saving. A huge thank you to Darren Curtis, who composed some of the music used in this episode. Check him out at darrencurtismusic.com. DARRENCURTIS music.com.
Active shooter. Reports of an active shooter. Active shooter.
Active shooter. Mass casualty incidents.
Make sure to check us out on social media. We have a discussion group on Facebook. Just search for Active Shooter, the podcast discussion group. You can also find us on Instagram at Active the Podcast and Twitter at Podcast Active. For just $1 a month, you can get access to ad-free episodes, early release episodes when available, and a shout-out on the show. Just go to patreon.com/activepodcast. Thank you, and be safe.